The Lincoln statue in Washington is not a sacred monument. It's a contract, signed in 1915 for $84,000. Today, that's the equivalent of $2.5 million. And that was pure profit. The cost of the marble was paid for separately. 90% of the work was done by others, nameless workers in his myth factory. He understood what business geniuses would only grasp decades later. National memory must have its own merchandising. The man who created this monument was not an artist. He was an industrialist. And his most personal creation, this perfect mansion, he built as the ultimate proof. To understand his design, you don't need to study contracts. You only need to see one thing, what he built on this land first. This is Chesterwood, a place where, it seems to us, time has stood still, where perfect lawns slope down to the forest and the shadows of old trees lie on the stone as if on eternity. This is a sanctuary, a temple built by an artist for the birth of gods for the American pantheon. Figures of bronze and marble who look down on us from pedestals and coins, defining who we are. We come here to touch the source. We speak in whispers. We believe that in this silence, in this perfect landscape, lies the secret of pure art. The secret of a genius who could speak to a nation in the language of immortality. But what if that's not true? What if this oasis is not a temple, but a headquarters? What if its creator was not just an artist, but a ruthless industrialist? A man who discovered that patriotism is the most stable of markets, who figured out how to turn national memory into personal capital. Look at him. This is not a tormented creator waiting for inspiration. This is Daniel Chester French. In his eyes, there is calculation. In his posture, power. He was the architect of the American soul, but he built it the way you build railroads or steel mills, with contracts, leverage, and a cold, unshakable will. Every corner of Chesterwood that seems to us today, the embodiment of harmony, was paid for by that will. This serenity is the result of battles won for government contracts. These ancient trees remember not only the changing of the seasons, but the changing of invoices. This is not a refuge from the world of Gilded Age industrial capitalism. It is its most perfect creation, a palace built on the profits from manufacturing symbols. The story of this place is not a story of art. It's a story of how myths are made, how ideals are cast in metal according to a pre-approved budget, and how the man who gave the nation its most sublime images built his personal empire on the most cynical of foundations, how his most personal creation, this mansion, became the ultimate proof. We are used to thinking that great art is priceless, that it is born in a moment of passion, in the quiet of a studio, far from the hustle and commerce. But every masterpiece has a budget, and every creator has a bank account. To understand Chesterwood, you must first see not the artist's brush, but the businessman's ledger. Let's forget about clay and marble for a moment. Let's talk about money. Here is the contract for the creation of the statue for the Lincoln Memorial. The amount, $84,000. In 1915, that was a fortune. Today, it's the equivalent of $2.5 million. This is not the fee of a genius. It's the revenue of a corporation called Daniel Chester French. He wasn't an artist, but its CEO. His product was memory, his target audience, a nation. He understood the fundamental law of American capitalism. The most reliable commodity is myth. And he put the production of myths on an assembly line. This was not a world of inspiration, but one of fierce competition. In the fight for the DuPont Memorial in Washington, he coolly pushed out another sculptor whose work had been deemed unsatisfactory. He didn't wait to be chosen. He made it so there was no other choice. Every one of his contracts was a masterpiece of financial engineering. The fee, that was pure profit. The cost of marble, the price of bronze, shipping expenses, all of it was paid by the client on top of the agreed-upon sum. He sold the idea, while the world paid for the materials. And he understood what business geniuses would only grasp decades later. A great brand must have merchandising. Smaller bronze replicas of his major works were sold to the living rooms of the wealthiest homes in America. He wasn't just selling a statue. He was selling a piece of national greatness, retail. Behind the facade of his studio hid a veritable factory. Low-paid assistants, whose names have been erased from history, did 90% of the rough work. They were the hands. He was the name on the contract, the brand that put the final signature on the work and took all the profit. Every dollar earned from these deals was a brick in the foundation of the future Chesterwood. This plasterwork was paid for with the blood of competitors. This view of the mountains, dividends from railroad company stock. This is not the income of an artist. It is the capital of an industrialist who turned history into the most liquid of assets. So, the capital was accumulated. The profit from manufacturing national heroes sat in bank accounts in New York. But money is just fuel. It needs a machine. It needs a theater that will prove to the world that the creator of gods is himself worthy of a place on Olympus. In 1896, Daniel Chester French made his masterstroke. He invested the capital earned from the heroes of the past into his own future. He bought land, 150 acres in the Berkshire Hills of Massachusetts. But why here, far from the committees of Washington and the banks of New York? The answer is revealed if you stand on the spot where he decided to build. From here, you can see Monument Mountain, not just a mountain, but a living page of American literature, celebrated by great writers. French wasn't buying acres. He was buying a backdrop for his legend. He was acquiring the ideal American landscape on which to place his name. Next, the style. He didn't choose the fashionable Victorian or the exotic Beaux-Arts. He chose colonial revival. This was not a matter of architectural taste. It was a political calculation. This style spoke of roots, of a connection to the founding fathers, of Republican simplicity and strength. French, the son of a New Hampshire judge, was building an ancestral home for himself. He was writing himself into an aristocracy of the spirit, creating a past he never had. This was not imitation. It was appropriation. For this plan, he needed an equal. And he found one in the architect Henry Bacon, an alliance of two titans, two perfectionists, who would together create the greatest monuments of the era and then clash in a battle over their legacy. But back then, at the very beginning, they were united. And here, French makes his main, most stunning statement, the one that reveals his philosophy better than 1,000 words. What does he build first? Not a house for his family, not drawing rooms for entertaining influential figures. He builds a studio, a huge one, expensive, technically complex, a cathedral dedicated to his craft, with ceilings 30 feet high, with giant doors capable of letting titans pass through, with a sophisticated light control system that turned the building into a precision optical instrument. This is a declaration, carved in stone and wood. It says, "I am a manufacturer. My work, my factory, is more important than my home, my family, my comfort. First, the workshop, then the house. First, the machine for creating gods, then the dwelling for a mortal." He had designed his perfect universe. Now he had to carve it out of a wild, defiant reality. The landscape that seems to us today the embodiment of natural harmony, measured down to the last leaf, was a battlefield in 1897. Daniel Chester French's first enemy was the land itself. He had not bought a park, but 150 acres of untouched chaos. Rock, clay, and swamp that resisted any idea of order. It was a wild beast, and French came not to ask, but to tame. He did not adapt to nature. He issued it an ultimatum. On archival maps, we can see his plan. This isn't gardening, it's terraforming. He doesn't lay paths. He dynamites rocks to carve out the arteries of roads. He doesn't plant trees. He uproots hundreds of them to create the perfect line of sight. His garden sketches were not suggestions, but battle maps, where every hill had to be taken and every stream had to be diverted into a new channel he had drawn. And then he opened a second front, against people. The local workers hired for the construction did not understand his language. It was a collision of two universes: metropolitan perfectionism, which runs on clocks and blueprints, and provincial slowness, which lives by the sun and by habit. He demanded the impossible. They gave him what they could. To him, it was sabotage. To them, it was just a job. Conflict was inevitable, and the solution was swift and unsentimental. He fired them, all of them. And then, using the power of his capital, he did what American industrialists before him had done. If the local workforce isn't suitable, you import your own. He paid to bring an entire crew from New York. This was his army, speaking his language, the language of deadlines, budgets, and absolute submission to the design. On his own land, he established his own laws. Chesterwood became his sovereign state. The foundation was laid. The external enemy, nature and people, had been conquered. But now he had to begin the main war. The war against matter, weight, and light. The war to create the perfect machine for manufacturing gods. Forget the image of an artist in a sun-drenched attic. The studio French was building wasn't a sanctuary, but an industrial workshop. Not a place for contemplation, but an engineering office. This isn't a building. It's an instrument for controlling reality. Imagine blueprints coming to life on screen. We see a cross-section, and it's not architecture, it's mechanics. First up, the ceiling. It's not just a roof, it's a trap for light. A massive skylight, but beneath it, a complex system of cables and counterweights controlling the shutters. With a single movement of his hand, French could conduct the daylight, creating harsh shadows or a soft, diffused glow. He didn't wait for the perfect light. He created it. Then, the north wall. It wasn't a wall in the usual sense. It was a set of gigantic, almost 30-foot doors. A technical challenge for its time. How do you make several tons of wood and steel move as effortlessly as a theater curtain? This was a wall that learned to disappear, transforming the studio into an open stage where sculpture met the real world. But the heart of this mechanism, its main innovation, was the rail platform. 50 feet of steel tracks, sunk into the floor, led from the dark depths of the studio out into the light. French understood what many of his contemporaries did not. A statue indoors and a statue in the open air are two different works of art. He had to see his giants as the world would see them, from a distance, surrounded by trees and clouds. This platform was a marvel of engineering. How could you make it, loaded with 10 tons of wet clay and plaster, move smoothly, without a single jolt that could destroy months of work? To achieve this, specially cast wheels were created, along with a system of levers that allowed 2 workers to move the weight of an entire house. All of it, the light, the wall, the platform, served a single purpose: absolute control. Control over scale. Control over perspective. French wasn't building a workshop. He was building a reality simulator, a weapon in his greatest war, the war for immortality. The machine was flawlessly designed. It required only one thing: fuel. And that fuel was all the money he had, and then some. Behind the majestic facade of stone and wood, behind the brilliant engineering solutions, lay a simple and brutal truth. The money was running out. The construction of Chesterwood, this perfect machine, had turned into a financial abyss that threatened to swallow its creator. We see his letters from that period, and in them, there's not a word about inspiration, only numbers, estimates, bills. $10,000 for the studio, another $20,000 for the house. Today, that sounds like the price of a good car. Back then, it was a fortune, enough to provide for 3 generations. And for French, it was almost his entire life savings. Behind the image of a self-assured gentleman, the master of his own destiny, was a man walking a tightrope without a net. Every new bill from a contractor was a gust of wind, threatening to throw him off. He invested everything he had earned in 20 years of non-stop work into this project. He staked his name, his future, and the well-being of his family. It was a race against time and his own capital. While workers erected the walls of his temple, he had to continue production in his temporary workshop. He couldn't afford a single setback, one broken contract, one dissatisfied committee refusing to accept a peace, one financial crisis freezing government commissions, and it all would have collapsed. Chesterwood would have remained an unfinished monument to his outsized ambitions. He would have become a bankrupt, a genius who had miscalculated his own strength. It was a daily, grueling battle with fear, a fear he couldn't show to his wife, his clients, or his workers. He was selling the world an image of stability and eternity, carved in stone, but his own reality was as fragile as plaster. He had built his fortress, but he failed to consider that the greatest threat would come not from the outside, but from within, not from bank statements, but from the studio of another genius who cast a shadow over him from the other side of these very hills. To understand why Daniel Chester French built Chesterwood on such a desperate scale, you have to understand that this wasn't just an estate. It was a fortress, a forward operating base in a war he had been fighting his entire life, an invisible war against a single man. His name was Augustus Saint-Gaudens. He was everything French was not. The son of an immigrant shoemaker, a rebel who had studied in the bohemian workshops of Paris. His sculptures were alive, breathing, full of nerve and tragic depth. He was a genius, recognized by all, and he was French's main rival. If French was a general, Saint-Gaudens was a prophet. French created idealized symbols of the Republic. Saint-Gaudens, the wounded souls of heroes. They were constantly compared. The press, the critics, the clients, they all divided American sculpture into 2 camps. Are you for French or for Saint-Gaudens? For cold, flawless classicism or for passionate psychological realism? This struggle wasn't about money, but something more. It was for the right to define how America would remember itself, for the title of the nation's greatest sculptor, and Chesterwood became French's primary weapon in this duel. When Saint-Gaudens founded his famous art colony in Cornish, New Hampshire, French responded by creating his own kingdom here in the Berkshires. It was as if he were saying, "Anything you can do, I can do. But I'll do it on a grander scale, with better engineering, with more perfect control." Chesterwood was his answer, his bid for supremacy. They never declared war openly. They exchanged polite letters, served on the same committees, but behind this gentlemanly facade, a relentless battle was waged for the most prestigious commissions, for influence, for a place in history. And then, in 1907, the war ended. Augustus Saint-Gaudens died of cancer. For French, it was a turning point. The shadow that had followed him his entire career had vanished. The rival who had forced him to constantly prove his greatness had left the stage. Now, he was alone atop the American Olympus. He had won. His empire was complete. His enemy was vanquished. Now, he lacked only one thing: the ultimate trophy. The commission that would etch his name into history forever. And that commission was already waiting for him. The machine was built. The financial storms had subsided. His rival had passed into eternity. Now Chesterwood, this perfect mechanism, had to justify its existence. It was created for a single purpose: to bring forth a masterpiece the likes of which America had never seen. And so, in 1914, the commission of the century finds its artist. The United States government decides to erect a temple in the heart of the Capitol, dedicated to its most revered martyr, Abraham Lincoln. Getting this contract was no easier than winning a presidential election. This was not an art commission. It was an arena where politics, money, and the most powerful egos in the country collided. Dozens of sculptors dreamed of this commission. It meant more than just fame. It meant immortality. And this is where Daniel Chester French revealed himself not as a sculptor, but as a grand strategist. He didn't wait to be invited. He began to act long before the competition was officially announced. He mobilized his entire network. Every dinner at the prestigious clubs of New York, every meeting in the corridors of power in Washington was part of his campaign. He didn't ask. He persuaded. He used his greatest weapon, his impeccable reputation. He was a man who never missed a deadline, who knew how to speak to committees in their language, the language of dignity, patriotism, and, just as importantly, budgets. His alliance with the architect Henry Bacon, who was designing the memorial itself, proved decisive. They presented a unified, unbreakable front. Bacon was creating the perfect temple. French promised to place the perfect God within it. The competition was swept aside. He got the commission. The pressure was unimaginable. This project was being watched not just by some committee. It was being watched by the White House. President William Taft personally visited Chesterwood to observe the progress. Every sketch, every clay model, was examined under a microscope. Any mistake could have been the end of his career. Everything he had built, everything he had invested his money and soul into, now had to work. The studio at Chesterwood was transformed from an artist's workshop into the center of a national project. The bets were placed. Eternity was at stake. And the first battle to be fought wasn't with clay, but with gravity. This wasn't a creative process. It was construction. The giant plaster figure of Lincoln was born not in the silence of inspiration, but amidst the roar, the creaking, and the strain of human muscles. The workshop had become a shipyard where they weren't building a ship, but a colossus. In archival photographs, we see French's assistants clambering over wooden scaffolding like workers building a cathedral. They aren't sculpting, they are slinging plaster with shovels. Each part of the body, an arm, a leg, a fold in the frock coat, was the size of a grown man. It was grueling, dirty, physical labor. French was the brain. They were his hands, his strength. Months were spent creating this white mountain. 10 tons of plaster and wood, frozen in the form of the pensive president. And then came the moment of truth. The moment for which the entire studio had been built. The giant had to be rolled out into the light. The rail platform, French's main engineering marvel, awaited its first serious test. The workers leaned on the levers. 10 tons had to be budged, and nothing happened. The mechanism, calculated on blueprints, met with the silent stubbornness of dead weight. The wheels were stuck. The platform didn't move an inch. A panic-filled silence hung in the studio. The entire complex system, which had cost a fortune, turned out to be useless. We can only imagine French's cold fury. He could not lose this battle with matter. The workers, using planks as levers and placing blocks under the wheels, inch by inch, with the screech and groan of metal, began to push the monster out. This was no longer an engineering task. This was primitive labor, like that of the pyramid builders. They got it out. The platform slowly rolled along the rails, carrying Lincoln out into the open sky. A victory? No. This was only the beginning of the nightmare. As the giant figure began to emerge, it became clear. They had miscalculated the most important thing. Lincoln's head, bowed in sad contemplation, was getting stuck in the opening of the 9-meter doors. A few more inches, and French's greatest creation would have been decapitated on the threshold of its own home. It was a moment of absolute, humiliating failure. The moment his entire brilliant machine broke down. It was in this instant of humiliation that a solution was born that would change everything. A solution that led to his greatest battle. A battle not with weight, but with light. A battle for the soul of his creation. On the blueprints for the memorial, created by Henry Bacon, everything looked perfect. A majestic temple, with Lincoln seated at its center, bathed in light pouring down from a skylight in the ceiling. It was a classic, time-tested solution. Light from the heavens, illuminating the martyr. But Daniel Chester French, having survived the technical nightmare in his studio, understood something the architect could not. Sculpture is not geometry. It is a play of light and shadow, and this play defines the soul. He began his most important war, not with plaster and steel, but with his friend and partner, Henry Bacon. Their argument, documented in dozens of letters, was fierce. Bacon, the architect, saw the building. French, the sculptor, saw the face. We can imagine this dialogue, ringing like an alarm bell between Washington and the Berkshires. Bacon insisted, "Overhead light is tradition, it's nobility." French replied in desperation, "You don't understand. You will kill the expression on his face." For French, the overhead light was a disaster. It turned Lincoln's deep, pensive eye sockets into empty black holes. It made his brow too heavy, and his mouth a lifeless slit. It turned the wise, suffering father of the nation into a blind idol. To prove his point, French turned Chesterwood into an experimental laboratory. He created an exact scale model of the Memorial Hall. He built lighting models, simulating both Bacon's overhead light and the frontal light he himself insisted on. He took dozens, if not hundreds, of photographs. Each one was irrefutable proof. Here is Lincoln under your light, Henry, and here he is under mine. Look, not at the blueprints. Look into his eyes. This wasn't a battle over a technical solution. It was a battle for a legacy, for how America would see its greatest hero for centuries to come. Would it see a cold monument or a living man, full of pain and compassion? And French, the businessman and diplomat, accustomed to winning over committees, also defeated the brilliant architect. He got his way. A complex system of electrical lighting was designed, which illuminated the statue from the front. He won back Lincoln's gaze. He saved the soul of his masterwork. But while this battle of titans was raging, the factory could not afford to stop. While the giant shadow of Lincoln occupied the center of the studio and all of its master's thoughts, the studio itself lived its own, parallel life. Chesterwood was never a monotheistic temple dedicated to a single god. It was a polytheistic pantheon where heroes were created simultaneously, wholesale, for the entire country. Lincoln was the flagship project, the showcase of the corporation. But the real profit, the cash flow, was generated by the assembly line work. A quick montage of archival photographs shows us this reality. In one corner of the studio, a model of the DuPont Memorial for Washington. In another, sketches of allegorical figures for the Wisconsin State Capitol. In the background, the bust of some philanthropist, commissioned for a university library. French operated in a multitasking mode that today would be called industrial. He was a conductor managing several scores at once. In the morning, he might spend hours on a fold in Lincoln's trousers, perfecting its form. And after lunch, having swapped his smock for a business suit, he would be discussing the estimate for an equestrian statue for a small town in Ohio. The key to this productivity was his assistants. They were not apprentices, but skilled workers on his assembly line. They prepared the clay, built the armatures, and scaled up the maestro's small sketches into full-size models. They performed 95% of all the physical and technical labor. French's role was that of quality controller and chief brand manager. He would appear at the crucial moment. With one precise movement of his finger, he would change the tilt of a head. With a single touch of his modeling tool, the expression of the lips, he breathed into these clay shells that very soul, that signature style for which the committees paid. He would place his signature and move on to the next workstation. Chesterwood hummed like a beehive, a constant flow of orders, letters, blueprints, calls from Washington, visits from clients. This was not a quiet corner for inspiration. It was a production facility, working in 3 shifts, a workshop where heroes were made to order, a factory where the official, approved, and paid-for version of American history was cast in bronze and carved in marble. Behind the image of absolute control, behind the facade of the smoothly running factory, lurked 2 primal fears that constantly haunted French. These were enemies that could not be defeated by a contract or by willpower, enemies that could destroy everything in an instant. The first enemy was fire. His studio, this temple of order, was in reality a powder keg. Wooden armatures, dry plaster, mountains of rags soaked in turpentine and oil. Any stray spark from the stove, any careless movement with a candle, and his life's work could turn to ash in a matter of minutes. This fear was almost a panic. He developed the strictest safety protocols, special metal bins for waste, a ban on smoking, regular chimney inspections. At night, it is said, he might wake up and go to check that everything was in order. He had built a machine that brought him immortality, and he lived in constant terror that this same machine would consume him. He controlled everything, except for one of the elements. His second enemy was matter itself, clay, plaster, and ultimately, stone. The Lincoln statue required perfect marble, 28 blocks of the purest white stone from the quarries of Georgia. Each block carefully selected, inspected, numbered. But stone is a living organism. It has hidden fissures, internal defects that are impossible to see from the outside. And that is exactly what happened. When the carvers began work on one of the key blocks intended for the face, they came across a treacherous dark vein, a flaw. The entire block was rejected. For French, this wasn't just a missed deadline. It was a rebellion of the material. It was a reminder that, despite all his blueprints and calculations, he was dealing with the chaos of nature. New blocks had to be ordered. They had to wait for weeks for them to be delivered. Precious time and money were lost. It was a constant, grueling war. A war with fire, which could destroy the form, and a war with clay, which could betray the vision. It was a struggle to force the imperfect material world to submit to his perfect idea. He won this war too. Lincoln was finished. The factory had reached the peak of its power. And now, Chesterwood could finally become what it had never been before: a home. The walls were raised. The statues were cast. The bills were paid. And Chesterwood, at last, began to live the life for which it seemed to have been created. It became the perfect stage where Daniel Chester French played his final and most important role, that of the patriarch. Archival photographs come to life. We see not an industrialist, but a hospitable host. Here he is on a clay tennis court, one of the first in the Berkshires, playing a match with his guests. Here he is, surrounded by family and friends, watching an amateur play performed right on the lawn of his perfect garden. His home became a center of gravity for society. Here, far from the hustle and bustle of the city, the destinies of American culture were being shaped. President Theodore Roosevelt sat at his table, discussing the future of the nation. The writer Edith Wharton walked his paths, perhaps finding prototypes for her characters here. The violin of Ephraim Zimbalist was heard in his living room, and the great Anna Pavlova danced. French had created a perfect world, a world where high art met with power and nature served as an exquisite backdrop. But was this backdrop a home? Was this a happy place? Behind the glossy facade, a shadow lurked, a tragedy that was never spoken of aloud: the death of their only son in infancy. This void, this unhealing wound, was at the very heart of their perfect world. Perhaps that is why French built his empire of stone with such desperate persistence, to fill a void that could not be filled by anything. And at the center of this world, in the shadow of giant statues and a great father, his daughter, Margaret, was growing up. She was the heir to the empire. She saw not only the grand facade, but also the hidden mechanisms. She knew the price of every stone in that wall, every statue in that workshop. She did not yet know that she was destined to become the primary guardian of this place, that she would have to wage a battle for her father's legacy, one that would prove to be far longer and more desperate than all of his wars for contracts and materials. But that would come later. For now, Chesterwood was living its golden autumn, unaware that its creator, like his century, was already approaching his end. Time cannot be cast in bronze. In 1931, Daniel Chester French was 81 years old. His era, the Gilded Age, had already become history. The world had changed, but he continued to work. Every morning, just as he had for 30 years, he went to his studio. His body was weakening, but his will remained unbending. He worked until his last day, his last hour, and on his workbench stood his final sculpture. The camera slowly focuses on it. It is Andromeda, the mythological princess, chained to a rock and left to be devoured by a sea monster. The figure is filled not with heroic pathos, but with a fragile, almost desperate vulnerability. It is unfinished. The sculptor's hands had only just begun to outline her form. The tools lie nearby, as if the master had just stepped away for a moment. His death in October of that year did not just stop a man's heart. It stopped the factory. For the first time in 33 years, absolute silence reigned at Chesterwood. The buzzing hive fell still. The creak of winches, the banging of hammers, the voices of assistants, all of it was gone. The mechanism built to produce eternity had itself become a victim of time. And in that silence, the main question hung in the air. What now? Chesterwood had served its function. It was a perfect machine for one particular genius. Now that the genius was gone, the machine was no longer needed. It could be sold, remodeled. Its unique mechanisms could be dismantled for scrap. Its gardens could be overgrown with weeds. The great factory of American gods, having outlived its creator, now found itself on the verge of death. Its fate hung by a thread. Only a miracle could save it, or a will equal to that of French himself. And that will was found in a person who had spent her entire life in his shadow. A new protagonist enters the stage, not a titan who creates gods, but a guardian who protects their cradle. His daughter, Margaret French Cresson. She watched as her father's world turned into a relic, as new styles in art made his classicism old-fashioned, as America itself changed, and she began her war. A war not for glory, but for memory. A war that lasted 40 years. Her enemies were far more formidable than committees and critics. Her enemy was time and progress. In the 1950s and 60s, there were plans to run a new highway through her land, right through the gardens her father had designed, right where his studio stood. It was a desperate battle, a lone woman against bulldozers and state plans. But her father's blood ran in her veins. She wrote letters, knocked on doors, mobilized the press, and she won. She stopped progress at the border of her world. But another enemy remained: money, or rather, the lack of it. Maintaining 150 acres and 22 rooms was ruinous. She sold off small parcels of land, invested her last personal funds to preserve the core of the estate, to keep the lights on in the studio, and in 1969, she made her final, decisive move. She gave Chesterwood everything she had to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. But she set one unbreakable condition: the studio. It had to remain exactly as her father had left it on that October day in 1931. Not a single tool, not a single sketch, not a single speck of dust was to be moved. French created monuments for the nation, but the most enduring monument to him was created by his daughter, who preserved not a bronze statue, but the very place where eternity was forged. Chesterwood survived not because it was an artist's home, but because it was an arsenal where the weapons of national mythology were created. And today, it reminds us that every god, even one carved in stone, has its price. Every legend has its factory. And the plaster Lincoln, the prototype of the great idol, still sits in his workshop, forever gazing out from the twilight at the very American landscape that his creator once bought, conquered, and made immortal. We came to Chesterwood to find a temple of art, and instead, we found the blueprints for a perfectly tuned factory. We were looking for a genius living in a world of ideas, and instead, we met an industrialist who turned national memory into the most liquid of assets. His legacy is not only the bronze gods, but this very land, which became a monument to a cold calculation that turned out to be indistinguishable from great inspiration. So where is the line drawn? At what point does a cost estimate become immortality, and a perfectly executed contract become a national shrine? The story of Chesterwood is not an answer, but an invitation to a dialogue. Share your thoughts in the comments. Where for you is that line between craftsmanship and genius, between commerce and pure creation? Your support, a like and a subscription to the channel, helps us continue to ask uncomfortable questions of great legends.